Hello and welcome. If you're new here, my name is Joe and I rant about the things I think we need to do to deal with the effects of, or coming effects of climate change. If you've been here before, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to go through an analogy that has typically applied to peak oil, but I think is a good warning for, again, the effects or coming effects of climate change. So the analogy I'm going to go through comes from, I want to give credit where credit is due, comes from a book called The Ecotechnic Future. I read this about 10 years ago or so, I think. It's written by John Michael Greer. The Ecotechnic Future, Envisioning a Post-Peak World. And the post-peak, the peak refers to peak oil. Let me just give a brief explanation of that. Peak oil refers to the time when we have reached the maximum global oil production capacity. So let me just give an example. Let's say there's 100 oil fields in the world, and any one of them can produce a maximum of 1,000 barrels of oil per day. So our global capacity would be 100,000 barrels of oil per day. How does any one field have a maximum capacity? Well, when oil is first discovered, when a field is first discovered, you don't know how much oil is underneath the ground. So through some drilling, through some testing, and through the discovery, you then decide, let's put an oil rig here. Let's say an oil rig can produce 10 barrels of oil per day. So you stick an oil rig on this new field, you're getting 10 barrels a day. You put another one on there, you're getting 20 barrels a day. You put another one on there, so on and so on. And you get up to 100 oil rigs operating. That's 1,000 per day. You reach a point where if you were to add any more, you're not going to get any more out of the ground total. So if you had 100 oil rigs and you added another 100 oil rigs, you'd still only get 1,000 barrels per day. Instead of the capacity of each one being 10, each one would produce 5. You just reach a point where geologically there's only so much volume at a time you can take out. So if you own the oil field, you're going to want to put no more than 100, because adding any more than that is a waste of money. It's a waste of oil rigs. You then reach a point where even though you have 100 oil rigs operating, the field can then no longer keep up with the pace of 1,000 barrels per day. It drops to 900, 800, 700. Now, why would this happen? Well, this would happen as, for geologic reasons, it gets harder and harder to just pull this liquid out of the ground. One reason is that the lighter oil that was at the top, think of it as like a buried water balloon, but the water balloon is oil. The lightest oil is at the top. The heaviest oil is on the bottom. So if you hear light crude or heavy crude, that's referring to the type of oil being withdrawn from a field. The light stuff's at the top. But once you've run out of the light stuff, you then have to go after the heavy stuff. And it gets harder and harder to get that stuff out of the ground. It's sludgier. And also just for volume purposes, you just can't leave a void under the ground. It's my understanding that there are many oil fields in Saudi Arabia where they inject seawater into the ground to then push the oil back out somewhere else, and then they remove the seawater, and what's left is whatever oil they were able to get. You wouldn't have to do that with a freshly discovered field where it just wants to come out. So anyway, peak oil refers to a time when just globally, no matter what we do, the amount of oil that we can take out of the ground at any given time will begin to decrease. We've already entered that phase. It hasn't really affected us all that much because we've replaced it with natural gas, but it has allowed other industries to pop up, like fracking, for example. The idea of getting oil out of shale. Squeezing oil out of a rock is a lot harder than just withdrawing liquid oil that was just in the ground waiting for you to do that. but that's where we're at. We're running out. There's still a lot of oil in the ground, but it's the most difficult oil to get out of the ground. That affects market prices. If a barrel of oil costs $60, but it costs you operationally $100 to get oil out of your field because it's near depletion, you're just going to leave it in the ground. If through supply and demand, the price of oil goes up over 100, suddenly it's worth your while to turn your field back on, turn those rigs back on. So anyway, this analogy refers to the drop-off in oil at a time when we've become more and more dependent on it as a fuel, as a lubricant for other substances. So anyway, I'm going to apply this to climate change. So here's the analogy. Let's say that there's a meadow, a grassy meadow somewhere. It's in equilibrium with its surroundings, and it contains mice. So there's some field mice. The population of those mice will ebb and flow, decrease and increase over the years based on several factors. The amount of available resources, how much food and water are there for the mice, and how many predators are around. So there'll be good years, there'll be wet years, the plants will overproduce. There'll be dry years, drought years, the plants will dry up, not produce as much. If there's less to eat, there's fewer mice, vice versa. So anyway, the mice are in equilibrium, their population, again, it increases and decreases over time, but it stays within a particular range. Now let's say that there's a road along the side of this meadow, and a grain truck is driving down this road and tips over. There's an accident, truck tips over, all the grain spills into the field. So they clean up the accident, leave whatever grain behind, and suddenly the mice have a food supply that the field by itself couldn't have naturally provided. So the mouse population increases and increases. It eventually hits another limit. It reaches a new equilibrium based on other factors. Food is no longer a problem. There's plenty of food. It's now based on how much water is there, and that many more mice has probably attracted more predators. You know, hawks that probably didn't pay attention to that field suddenly are, because there's suddenly a lot more mice, and foxes and whatever else. So the increasing population has attracted more predators, has required more water, and they just need more space to live in and trample on and poop on, and just more mice means more damage to the field, but it's okay. The field is no longer producing the food that it needed to. They're all getting it from that pile. Eventually you hit a point where that pile starts to diminish such that it's harder just to get at it. You have the same number of mice trying to get at a smaller pile. So that's going to impact the population some, but when the day comes and the pile is gone, the pile's just no more grain. The party's over. The mouse population is going to suddenly drop, drastically drop, because all they have left is whatever the field can provide, which number one was never enough to support that size population, and number two has now been damaged by the existence of a larger population of mice, and there's now that many more predators in the area that previously weren't. So the mouse population drops not to what it was before the accident. It drops even more because the field can't support as many mice as it once did, and the few mice that it can support are getting eaten by other things. So after the accident, for a while, the mice go through a booming population. Afterwards, there's an overshoot in the other direction, and the field may never recover because of the overpopulating of the mice for whatever period of time that went on. So if you think of the way COVID-19 has affected our very existence, we've seen how fragile our transportation industry and manufacturing and our food supply is. So if something were to happen where instead of a virus that affects humans, something comes along that affects our food supply, our agricultural industry just is in really big trouble. We just cannot produce food on a large scale for whatever reason. Or for whatever reason, the entire trucking industry just shuts down. We can no longer move these things around. We can't have California being the only place in the world we grow spinach. Because if there's no trucks, that spinach can't get anywhere. It'd be just like that pile suddenly drying up. What do we do? What is around us that can provide for us? Very little. We've become very dependent on manufacturing of things that then are brought to us from far away, food that is grown from far away, water that is piped to us from far away, electricity that is generated far away. We need to adapt to relocalizing literally everything, even down to the household level, because of climate change. Because climate change is going to have an impact on all of those things. So the peak oil analogy has to do with, like, we found oil, you can only discover it once. It's like the truck tipping over. It's only that freak accident will only happen once. But it's a good analogy of the dangers of how fragile our systems are if any one of them fail. And so outside of the issues of when we truly do start running out of oil to the point where it's very noticeable in our manufacturing and energy production, beyond that, our food production, everything else that we rely on, that spigot could turn off just like that pile suddenly disappearing because of climate change suddenly disrupting how those systems work. So hopefully this analogy made some sense. If it didn't, oh well. So anyway, thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw, please click like. If you want to see more, keep up with the other things I rant about with regards to climate change, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.